All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So my name is Andrew. I work for Oasis Digital. We're better known as AngularBootcamp.com. So we train people in Angular, usually 3-day classes. We have 2 meetups in the St. Louis area that I wanted to point out. We have an Angular lunch and a general meetup in the evening. And the URLs for those are on the whiteboard over here. So if you're interested in Angular and want to learn more, want to get involved in the community, definitely check that out. Today I'm going to talk about drag and drop, which is part of the Angular Material CDK. We'll see that it'd be a good thing if that was showing. It makes adding drag and drop to your application very straightforward.
So, excuse me, what is CDK? Like, I know SDK.
We'll get into that. There we go. All right. So just an overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll introduce Angular really briefly for anyone who isn't familiar with it. I'll talk about Angular Material, and then I'll introduce the CDK and specifically drag and drop. I'll show some code and a couple of example apps. So first, what is Angular? This is Google's JavaScript, actually TypeScript framework for building single-page applications. It targets the web, so you can build for desktop and mobile. You can also do native applications using third-party frameworks. So there's a few for mobile. I'm most familiar with Ionic, and there's desktop, so you can use Electron. I've used that a little bit as well. And if you see NG, that's a common abbreviation for Angular. So a lot of packages are named NG this, NG that. So material design. Material design is a design language that Google created in 2014. It's seen in most Google web apps and devices and native applications as well. The general principle is that the UI should be generally flat components with shadows and animations. And so while it's not skeuomorphic, so it doesn't look like things in real life, things on the screen should generally behave like real objects. So things shouldn't like suddenly appear, they should animate in and things like that. So because it's Google's like appearance for all of their applications, they have a broad, support for different platforms. Angular Material. So this is the implementation of the material design language for Angular specifically. So it's more than a CSS and JavaScript component framework. So common examples of those are like Bootstrap and Clarity. So it goes a little bit farther in that it gives you actual Angular components and directives. And since it's Angular native, they're all exposed as ng modules. So you can bring in just the pieces that you want to use in your application. So if you want to use like just the material slider, you can bring in just that part, dialogues, things like that. So this is an example of what that looks like in an Angular application. This is actually the Angular Material website, which is shown there. And so everything looks like very similar to what you'd see on Android, but in the browser. And the other thing is that since it is material, it's very, opinionated, or it gives you the look and feel. It doesn't give you very many options to customize it. So that's kind of one of the caveats to using material is your application is going to look like a Google application, which may or may not be a bad thing, but that's one thing to keep in mind. So Google also has a part of the material, the Angular Material library, something that they call CDK. This is a component development kit. This sort of represents more low-level functionality that Angular Material has. And the idea is that you could use the CDK to build your own component library. So if you didn't want anything to do with the material appearance and you wanted to use something totally different and you wanted to build it in Angular, you could use the CDK to build that. So one way to think of it is Angular Material without styling. That's not totally accurate because the CDK doesn't give you like, here's a button, and if you apply your own like 5 lines of CSS to it, you'll get your own button. It gives you like low-level functions for seeing like whether the page is rendering with text left to right or right to left. It'll give you information about what kind of browser you're running on. So most of the things that come in the box of the CDK are really low level like that, and then you build on top of it using a lot of CSS, for example. So yeah, the idea is this will work well with other component libraries like Bootstrap and Clarity, as I mentioned, or you can use your own styles. One of the things that's in the CDK that was added as an experimental feature halfway through 2018, and then it became a full feature like around November, I think, is the drag and drop feature. So this one isn't so low level as most of the other things in the CDK. You can actually use this to build something really straightforwardly in your application. So yeah, it was added in version 7 of Angular Material CDK, which roughly coincides with version 7 of Angular. It gives you a declarative way to make drag and drop features in your application. So you don't have to like listen for low-level events and then manage your state of the component in your TypeScript. You can just say, I want this thing to be draggable, and here are the places where it can be dragged to. And you do that right in your template. So this is the complete list of features for the drag and drop feature in the CDK. So the first one is free drag. And with that, you can move a component anywhere on the screen. And when you let go of the mouse, or if you're using mobile, if you lift up your finger, the item will stay in that place. You can also reorder within a list. So there's a concept of lists, and that's what you see here. This is straight from the API documentation on the Material CDK website. So you can click on an item and drag it to a different place. You can also move items between lists, so like Google Calendar or a Trello board. You can move between multiple lists in your application. And so far, like all these things are, again, declarative. You can do animations. So the two that they point out specifically in the API documentation is you can animate when someone moves an item in the list and lets go. You can animate the item moving into place. You can also animate things being reordered, and we'll see that in a moment. They have full support for touch devices. You can use custom drag handles. So if you wanted a specific place in the item that you had to click to drag it, you can do that. You can have previews. So this is when you are dragging an item, it's actually technically a different element in the DOM. And so this is called a preview. So they have that idea. There's a placeholder, so that's this item as it appears in the list while you're moving. And then you can also change the axes for the lists, so they don't have to be vertical. And you can also lock in the movement of a draggable item along one axis. And we'll see most of these in a moment. So I guess why use the CDK's drag and drop feature rather than a different one? There's several others that listed here. I don't have a lot of experience with any of these. I've looked briefly at their feature lists. The main reason is that you get first-party support with the CDK drag and drop. So once something becomes a first-party feature, it's generally best to use that feature unless it doesn't have something that you need. So an example of that is when they released the experimental version. I used it in one of our applications for a customer. And I found like a small bug that wasn't like a real problem, but it was kind of going to be a problem if somebody was using the app. So basically, like if you had a list that was empty and you moved an item into that list and then you moved it back, it ended up breaking the state of the drag and drop. So I put an issue on GitHub. They elevated it within an hour to be like a second highest level in whatever the ranking is for issues. And then within like 2 days, they fixed it. So it's pretty good support. And then of course it's built for Angular, so you get you use directives to use it rather than applying like CSS classes to elements. And it works well with Material itself, Angular Material, as well as other component libraries. I have an example of that later. So the basic way that you use it is you can pretty much take any element in your template and then add the CDK drag directive to it. And that will apply the, so a directive in Angular, if you're not familiar with that, is basically a selector that you can put onto HTML elements, and it tells Angular to attach some code essentially to that element. So this element will become will have the code for a CDK drag class. Basically, it's basically a TypeScript class, and then this element will become draggable. So when you use this, and this is all you do, then the element becomes a free dragging element, so you can drag it anywhere and then let go and it will stay there. And so to use it in your project, to get started, it's pretty straightforward. You do an npm install of the CDK. An npm install is how you generally install packages in any Angular or Node application. Then you need to import the module in your either app module, or if you have other modules in your application, whichever one you're using it in. And then you can just add the directive in your HTML. So I'll go ahead and show this. So if you weren't here for the workshop earlier, StackBlitz is a really nice way to play around with different Angular features and not have to spin up a whole CLI application. So I'm going to start an Angular one. So it scaffolds out a simple app for me. And now if I want to add the dependency, I can go under the Dependencies tab and just enter the package name. And this is kind of like doing an npm install. So I'll do @Angular/CDK. And once I do that, then I need to add it to my app module. So I'll do import. And it's from the drag drop part of the package. It's the drag drop module, and I'll add it to the imports list. So once I do that, I have access to all of the drag and drop features, so the directives and other kinds of TypeScript imports. So once I save that, then I can go into my template for app component, and I can attach it to an element like this. And then if it refreshes, I can drag it around. So it really is that simple to get going. One thing to note is if I put this on the hello component and I refresh, then I actually can't move this element around. And the reason isn't that I have to do something special for Angular components versus native HTML components. What's going on here, if I inspect the element, is that the component itself is not taking up any space in the DOM. Rather, its content is. So when I actually go and hover over it and try to drag, I'm clicking on the H1 rather than the hello component. So one thing I can do is make the hello component display block. So if I go in here and I do hello, and I save that, and that becomes draggable.
Is that true for all components you make? They don't natively take up space until you apply a block styling to that selected?
Generally, yes. Yep. So And there's features in the CDK that lets you attach your directive, like make a thing draggable that isn't directly the thing that you've put the directive on. So if because your CSS library like added elements around your element, then you can get access to the top level element. So that's how you can get started with the CDK drag and drop module. I have a playground app. So this is what people call like an application where you can play around with an API and see how it works. So I put this on GitHub if you're curious to look at that. And so here, I'm on the basic tab. So this is showing the different ways that you can use a CDK drag directive. So we've already seen the free drag by just applying the CDK drag. And what this means is these are the like attributes and properties that I'm putting right on the HTML element. If I lock the axis, then I can only drag it along the x-axis. Same with the y. And I can also use a drag handle, whereas the actual drag element then isn't draggable. So then in addition to just draggable elements, you can define where they can be placed so they can belong to a container. And these are called drop lists. And the easiest way to use drop lists is to define a group for them. So in this case, to use the CDK drop list group, you can apply that directive to any element that's a parent of the CDK drop elements. So here I have an element that the others are contained in this case a div, and I've applied the CDK drop list group directive to it. And so that connects these two lists together. And that tells the CDK that these lists can, the items in them can be dropped back and forth. So here I can drag to the second list, and I can drag back. So the things that are shown here, these are the directives I've applied to these elements. And the CDK drop list has several inputs and outputs. I'm using two here, one input to give it the data for all of the elements in it. So array A is an array of strings in this case, and each element corresponds to one of the drag items. Then there's an event that occurs whenever I drop an item in the list. And so you can see that when I drop an item, it updates the array. And it only does that when I lift up on the mouse because I'm listening to the dropped event. There's also a sorted event that you can use. And then I'm actually displaying each of the elements down here using an ng-for. So this is how you can do an iteration in your template in Angular. And so I'm iterating over each element in the array. I'm getting a local variable for the string, and then I'm able to use that in the element. And so without doing this, the rest of the features work except for moving to a different list. And so I could like drag this over here, but without listening for this dropped event, it won't actually move the element to the other list. I can also disable the group, and then none of these are draggable. So they added this grouping feature in the full version. So before you had to set it up manually, and I'll show that in a minute. You used to have to tell each list what the other lists were that it was connected to. But this is a much more convenient way to use it. So another feature that the CDK gives you is the ability to use CSS classes to style different elements that are part of the drag interface. So this key here is showing all of the different classes that the CDK applies, and I'm showing what they look like. So in this case, the .cdk drop list CSS class is applied to each of the drop lists. And this is all being done by the CDK. And then each of the drag elements has a CSS class as well. If I actually drag one of these, then it automatically applies those other classes to the different elements. So the receiving class is applied to all the other lists that you could drag it to. You can use that to highlight to the user which places they can drag to. There's also the origin, so this dash dragging class is where it's coming from. Oops. It also applies a class to the placeholder, so you can highlight or do anything you want to with the original item. And then the item that you're actually dragging, it also puts a class on that. So as I move it around, it updates these classes, and if I let go, then it does the right thing. It also gives you the ability to animate these two different actions. So when you're sorting, it'll allow you to animate this using a CSS transition. So this is just pure CSS using these selectors. And you can also animate the dropping. So when I let go, it animates the item moving into the list. Another feature that they added in the full version for version 7 is the ability to give it a function to run on each item that's trying to be dropped into the list. So in this case, I can give it a predicate function that looks for whether the string is equal to 2. So that's this function here. So when I drag items out, I can drag any of them to the other list because I don't have a predicate on this one. But if I try to move back, I can't move any of the others back. I can only move the 2 item. So then there's some more features of the CDK drop lists. This is essentially the full API for the drop list directive. So you can give it an ID for itself, a string for that, and then you can tell other lists whether they can connect to that ID. So here, if I can connect it to drop list B, then the items in here can be dragged over here to the other list. But then I can't move back until I connect the 2. And this is because I'm not using a drop list group. There's also events that fire. So we already saw the dropped event earlier. I have these little pieces of text that highlight when the events fire. So if I move one, you can see that the exited event occurs in this one, and then you get an entered and a dropped. And sorted happens if you sort or change the order of the items. And dropped occurs whether you've dropped into a new container or the same one. You can disable the drop lists. So like with the groups, it just disables you from dragging any of the draggables. And I can change the orientation as well. The orientation feature, it doesn't actually like change the CSS to make the items appear horizontally. You're basically telling the CDK, I'm setting this as like display flex with the axis being horizontal, and then it knows to do the right thing using that. So you have to have both of those pieces. So if I connect these two together, then I can move them back and forth. If I, of course, disconnect one by not giving it anything in the string, then I can't drag it to the other list. For the drag items, the CDK drag items, I don't have an example that goes through it with this kind of depth, but the API is fully described here. A lot of the features are the same, so they have a disabled feature. They also have a data feature for each individual drag item. So if you're interested in that, they also have a whole lot more events. So ended, entered, exited, moved. So if you need to know basically anything that's happening imperatively, you can do that. So for the second app, I have an example app that's using the CDK drag with a CSS library that's not material. So in this case, it's Clarity. So I made an example like calendar application, kind of like Google Calendar, but not as good. So if I click anywhere, I can like enter some text. Then it becomes an item that I can drag around. Since I'm using Clarity, I just kind of added the ability to change the color using this menu. So if I make several items, then I can move them anywhere. And I'm doing this using that container element. So this is also on GitHub. It's linked to from the other one. So if you're interested, you can get there from here. So we'll just peek at the source for this to show what I'm talking about, since everything's kind of been like shown as text in the browser so far. So this is the code for the calendar. This is the layout of a typical Angular application. So you have your package JSON as any node or any NPM project has. There's an Angular JSON file that configures the application, tsconfig for TypeScript settings. And the source code by default is under source and then app. And so in this application, in my root component, I am simply putting the calendar component. So if I look at that, I have, now I wanted to use the Clarity styles for the calendar, so that's why I'm using a table, because the table is styled by Clarity by default. I wouldn't generally use a table to do like a calendar sort of application. That's why I'm using it here. If I apply the directive then to the body of the table, then anything that's in the body gets connected together, and that means that I can drag between any of the days. So this is showing that you don't have to put it on a div, you can put it on almost pretty much any element. And then for each row of the calendar below the heading, I have a loop for each week. So each row for each of the weeks in the calendar. And then for each day within the week, I have another loop over this days array. Each one of these are just arrays from 0 to 6 in the case of weeks, and 0 to 4 in the case of weeks, and 0 to 6 in the case of days. And then each of the days, so this is each of the cells in the table, is a CDK drop list. I do that by applying the directive. And then I pass in the data for that day. In this case, the data for it is an array of form controls. So I'm using actually a form group that has 2 form controls inside of it. So I'm using a form group to hold the state. That would be the text that's shown in the item as well as its color. Those are the 2 pieces of state. So this is actually a 3-dimensional array. I have the first dimension is the week number, then the day number, and then the final one is the index of the day itself. So this would be the index of 1 item, and then the vacation would be the index of 0 item. And so I'm also listening to the click event. This is a native HTML event. In Angular, you can listen to any event using parentheses. And so whenever the click occurs, I call this new entry method on the component, and that adds a new form group to the entry state. So if I look over here, new entry, it gets the entry state at the week and day location, and then in the one-dimensional array that's for the individual day, I just push in a new form group, and I start out with an empty string and an empty string for the color as well. In the colors case, I'm just using the string as the CSS class to apply. So when I give it an empty string, I'm not applying any class, so I get gray. So then I also listen for the dropped event from the CDK, and I'm just doing the standard thing that the CDK tells you to do with the dropped event. So if we look at the code for that, these are two functions that the CDK gives you that you can use. So what this is doing, the dropped event calls this method and passes in this CDK drag drop object, and this contains the information about the event. And so we check to see if the previous container is the same as the container it was dropped in. That means that you're just rearranging things within one list. So then you can use the move item in array function from the CDK to just change the index of that item in the array. So the event actually has a pointer to the container, and you can use that to get the data. So the data here for the container is actually coming from this input. So whatever you tell it is the data for the list. That's what you get from here. And so then it's just telling it which indices to swap. You could do this manually if you wanted to, use something like Lodash, but they give you a convenience function to use. And then there's also a transfer array item, so that's when you drag to a different list. So there's a previous container key that you can use in the event to get the previous one, whereas the container is the current container it's being dropped in. Oops. So then for each of the draggable items, that would be the colored labels in the days. I've put a CDK drag on it, and because I was still living in the past with the experimental version, you used to have to say that the drag item, you used to have to tell it what part of the DOM is the thing you can click on to drag it. So you don't actually have to do this anymore, because if you don't have a handle, then the whole thing is draggable. And then I'm iterating over each form control in the state for that day to make each of the labels. And I pass in that form control to the component. So this is a component that I made, just an standard Angular component. And this is a custom input with the @input decorator. I have a event to say when the item should be deleted. So if I go into an item and I delete all the texts and hit enter, then the component says delete me to its parent. And so I have a delete entry method to do that. And that removes the state element from the array that I get from this. And then this line is just to make sure that this click event doesn't also trigger the new entry event on its parent element. Because otherwise, whenever I clicked, then I would get this event happening as well. So this is the template that I have for the calendar itself. As you can see, it works just fine with another component library, so you're not restricted to Angular Material, even though you're using a piece of the Angular Material library. And that's, again, totally by design. The classes that I've applied, some of them are my own, and some of them are for clarity. So here, this is some clarity stuff that's applying that styling to the table. And this will work similarly for Bootstrap or any other component library. The drop-down component is just this component for doing this drop-down menu. The entry itself doesn't have any drag and drop specific things in it. Basically, doing the right things with the drop-down and showing the text area whenever it's selected. I'll show the state, how I'm doing that with the form control. So one of the things that's not like immediately obvious about the Angular Forms system is that it's a really great way to store state in an application because it exposes everything as observables. So even if you're not storing something that's directly a control, sometimes if it lives along with other control things, you can just stick some state in there. So I'm using the form builder to create these form groups. And the form builder is a service that Angular gives you that you can inject in any component. So I'm doing dependency injection here. I'm putting the form builder service, a reference to it, into the calendar so that I can use it. And the form builder gives you a nice way to make form groups and form arrays. So the syntax here for form group is I give it an object where the keys are the names that I want to have for the controls. And then the right side is an array of properties about that control. So in this case, it's going to make a control that's initialized with an empty string and no validators. If I wanted validators, I could put them after the initial value. And validators are used when you're making like a real actual form and you want to check if the user has like entered a correct email address or phone number. You can do that. But in this case, I'm just storing some state for, in this case, an actual control. And in this case, I guess it is kind of a control because it's a menu, but I'm declaratively telling it to put the string yellow, for example, into this color form control. And then whenever that changes, anything that's subscribed to the state can get those changes. When I actually use the form controls, then I can, on components or elements that support it, so like inputs and text areas and things, you can do use the form control input that Angular adds to the application and assign it the form control. So I'm able to get the text form control out of that form group by using the get method. And then for changing the color, as I mentioned, I'm like setting it here. You can also like imperatively set individual values in your state, or even like a group of values that's not all of them, by using patch value. So that'll just set the color control to the value that I supply it here. And then I'm able to get the color out of the state. So here I'm getting the entire value of the state as an object, and then I'm able to get just the color from that. So here I'm not actually using the state for its observable interface. I'm just actually getting the property itself. And this works because Angular's zone detects that changes have happened, so it updates the template. But you could just as easily use value changes and subscribe to it if you needed to in your TypeScript. There's a few other like housekeeping things happening in here too. Things like when you click on the element and you want to like edit the text, it'll set the selected property to true, which will cause the actual color element to be removed from the DOM, and then it will put the text area in instead. So that's how that works when I'm able to click on it. Oh, this is the test. So here, I'm doing a few things imperatively here, like setting the value to be the states. I'm automatically selecting the element if the text is empty. So when that's when I'm initially clicking, it creates the new element with an empty string. It detects that by seeing if the string is empty when the component is created, and if it is, then it selects the component that makes the text area appear. So that's what's happening here. This is all kind of not related to the drag and drop stuff. The drag and drop stuff was quite a bit simpler to do just because most of it's happening in the template. And again, you can use this drop list group to connect all your drop sites together. The way you used to have to do it was actually make an array of all of the references to all of the drop sites and then pass that in. Being able to just make a parent element have this directive is a lot easier. So, so that's all I have for this presentation.
Is there keyboard option to drag and drop, or the CDK is all dependent on mouse?
It's all mouse and touch based. There's no built-in keyboard way to drag items. You might be able to, there's a way to, in the API, to tell the CDK to drag an item to another location. So you could listen for keyboard events and then tell it to move items around, but there's no way to, in the template, just tell it to do that. I have, again, these examples on GitHub, so if you're interested in that, I have the link there. Again, we have the 2 meetups. If you're interested in learning more about Angular, definitely check that out. If you have any more questions, just let me know. I hope you enjoyed it.